This is a government, Mr. Speaker, that knowingly puts Saskatchewan families at risk. Right. This is a government that has not been transparent with all the facts, a government that has been pretending to take decisive and bold action against the will of SaskPower. But PricewaterhouseCoopers report is very clear. Right. So PricewaterhouseCoopers has taken away, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's only line of defence of the minister responsible for SaskPower. My question to the Premier, will he fire the Minister of SaskPower? And, Mr. Speaker, will he take the minister to task for not being forthcoming about when he knew, Mr. Speaker, and what he knew?
This government just ploughed ahead, and it kept putting those exact same meters that were catching on fire in Philadelphia onto homes of hundreds of Saskatchewan people more than 2 years ago here in Saskatchewan. How can the Premier defend that? How can the Premier continue to stand by that minister? We're not asking hypothetical questions, and we're getting hypothetical answers from the minister asking what actually happened, Mr. Speaker.
Time and time again, that minister responsible for SaskPower has sat on his hands, has not told Saskatchewan people what he knows, has not told the media what he knows, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier now is covering up for the minister not telling the full story.
This government knew about smart meter fires in Philadelphia, and in fact it was so afraid it removed 400 meters from homes in Hanley in the fall of 2012. But in committee, the government characterized the field test as going well, and it characterized the project as running according to plan. In the annual report tabled by that minister, he characterized the botched Hanley smart meter experiment as successful. This isn't just a business deal gone bad, Mr. Speaker. This is a case of the government putting the safety of Saskatchewan families at risk and then refusing to be transparent about it. So again, to the Premier, how much more does he need to hear about that minister's incompetence before he will finally make a bold and decisive decision to remove him from cabinet?
This government's approach to seniors' care is absolutely appalling, Mr. Speaker. In the throne speech, there was nothing new for seniors' care. Problem solved. Instead, this government just patted itself on the back, talked about its grossly inadequate one-time payment fund from last year, and pretended that all is well. When residents, families and frontline staff are telling us that seniors are still not getting baths for weeks at a time, that they're lying in filth, that their basic needs are being neglected because of short staffing, that should be a wake-up call for this government, Mr. Speaker. To the minister, how many concerns does this government need to hear before it will finally stop neglecting the basics in seniors' care?
Mr. Speaker, I have heard the truth from frontline workers. I have heard the truth, Mr. Speaker, from senior health administrators. I have heard the truth from the Minister of Health, who says that the John Black contract isn't even tailored for Saskatchewan's needs, Mr. Speaker. What we see from this Premier is an attempt at deflection. What we see is his ongoing pursuit about optics and damage control, Mr. Speaker. I was invited by healthcare workers to go on lean stuff, and guess what? This government didn't allow it to happen, Mr. Speaker, because they want to control. They want to handle everything. For them, Mr. Speaker, it's all about the optics. There's so much about this government's Lean Pep project with John Black that does not pass the smell test for Saskatchewan people. The email, Mr. Speaker, talks about the outcomes of John Black workshops, how we can make them sound extra special. Well, Mr. Speaker, according to John Black's pay schedule, each of these workshops cost $47,000. My question to the Premier, for $47,000 a pop, doesn't he think every of the workshops should be extra special?
It doesn't make an ounce of difference to that Premier that minister was sitting in committee knowing full well there were safety issues and not clarifying any records. Like a Premier. In fact, when media asked him why Saskatchewan ratepayers should have to pay for research and development on a new smart meter that can work in Saskatchewan, the SaskPower minister actually said, quote, because no one else is doing it, end quote. Well, perhaps the SaskPower minister has forgotten the briefings he's received about the smart meter program that the Saskatoon Light and Power runs, because they use a German-made smart meter, and I understand report no problems. To the Premier, does he realize that Saskatoon has the same unique climatic conditions, bit of rain, bit of snow, bit of wind, as the rest of Saskatchewan, and they've been using German-made meters for years, haven't been reporting problems?
On this side, we believe there's a role for government in delivering social housing and affordable housing. But that government cares more about its relationship with private developers than it does about Saskatchewan families. To the Premier, What will it take for this government to realize that the public sector has a crucial role to play in delivering social and affordable housing?
And this government, Mr. Speaker, love to have their dog and pony shows. They love to orchestrate the photo ops. They love to go in, polish the floors, and have all the yes people sitting around, Mr. Speaker. But if this government was actually interested in tours, actually interested in finding out what's going on in our healthcare system, they would pay some surprise visit to healthcare facilities and speak with the people on the front lines. The healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker, that are run off their feet. The healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker, who don't have enough time to clean the emergency room so they're filthy. The maintenance workers, Mr. Speaker, who don't have the resources to make the repairs that they need to do. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is, will he visit with the frontline workers and actually find out what's going on in the front lines of healthcare?
To even consider what the Minister of SaskPower in the smart meter debacle has been saying, as to consider it as a half-truth, would be generous, Mr. Speaker. That minister knew full well and was briefed of safety concerns, and that government continued to strap dangerous, fire-prone smart meters on the homes of Saskatchewan people. Absolutely unacceptable.
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that as a resource-producing and trade-dependent province, it's incredibly reckless for us not to be smart and diligent on environmental protection, environmental assessment, and doing our part to address climate change. Saskatchewan people get that, but this government just doesn't seem to get that. It has cut climate change funding by 82% since 2009, and it left the entire chapter on climate change and greenhouse gases emissions out of its shiny new environmental code. There's a pattern going on with this government. They promised back in 2009, 4 environment ministers ago, that would have put a price on carbon for large emitters, and the money would go into a Saskatchewan technology fund to finance investments. 5 years later, the technology fund still isn't up and running, and it's not for a lack of planning. No, we've got the internal business plan for the technology fund. It was prepared by Myers Norris Penny back in 2010. The fund is ready to roll. It's got 100 pages of very specific details on how this fund is going to operate. But 4 years later, Mr. Speaker, 4 years later, still no follow-through. To the minister, when will we see your famous technology fund in action?
An internal org chart, Mr. Speaker, shows that this government's $14 million American lean consultant is at the same level as the Deputy Minister of Health. It's the $14 million consultant, Mr. Speaker, that tattles on leaders who dare question John Black's authority. The one that senior leaders say, Mr. Speaker, lacks respect. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, does he really think that that is an appropriate placement for such a toxic consultant? Mr. Speaker, it's this government that has chugged the Kool-Aid coming from John Black. It's this government, Mr. Speaker, that has meddled with the role of the Health Quality Council, and it's this government, Mr. Speaker, that should fire John Black.
The Switch Clinic serves many vulnerable people in the core area of Saskatoon, and by doing so, it helps reduce the strain on St. Paul's Hospital. Better core funding for this important program should be a no-brainer for this government. Better core funding. Even if the government cancelled just 2 of John Black North American Lean tours, just 2, Mr. Speaker, it could cover the entire annual budget of Switch.
On Friday, a smart meter on the side of Joan Reimer's home here in Regina started on fire. Joan says she woke up to an exploding sound, looked out her bedroom window and saw flames. The burning meter started her barbecue cover on fire, which could have quickly spread to the propane tank. Thankfully, Joan was home and was able to deal with the fire immediately. But it's shameful that this government has failed to contact all Saskatchewan families that have had these fire-prone smart meters strapped to their homes, to tell them how dangerous these meters are and to ensure measures are taken in order to minimize damage and save lives.
My question, Mr. Speaker, is for the SaskPower Minister. What is the total final cost to Saskatchewan taxpayers of the Boundary Dam carbon capture project? Mr. Speaker, I hope the SaskPower Minister is being entirely honest with that number, because we've heard from insiders that the actual total cost is about $1.6 billion. How can Saskatchewan people judge the true merits of this project without proper transparency?
This government used to give $10,000 a year to the Science Ambassador program at the U of S, but this year it gave nothing. The Science Ambassador program makes science fun and relevant for Aboriginal kids in remote northern communities. Supporting this program is an investment in our province's future, Mr. Speaker, but this government slashed $10,000 from this program. It has $3,500 per day for each Japanese lean sensei, but it can't find $10,000 a year to improve science education for Aboriginal kids in northern Saskatchewan. Once again to the minister, without blaming the U of S, how can this government justify nickel and diming Aboriginal education?
Hear, hear. Speaker, it's absolutely unacceptable to see this government walking away from First Nations children, Métis children in northern Saskatchewan when it comes to science education, Mr. Speaker. A $10,000 program, Mr. Speaker, a program more than that with $10,000 of funding from the government, Mr. Speaker. And what do we see? We see the minister going for the cake, going for the balloons, Mr. Speaker, but axing the funding. It makes absolutely no sense. And we see the contrast in priorities. They have $3,500 per day, Mr. Speaker, for every sensei, but they nickel and dime a program for $10,000. That's a rounding error for John Black's travel on any given day, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Premier, will he admit that it was a mistake to cut the funding for the Science Ambassador program?
Recognize the Minister of Education.